My name's Stephan Livera. I host a Bitcoin and Austrian economics podcast. I teach a lot of people about Bitcoin. I'm also head of education at Swan Bitcoin. Thank you. And joining me today is my friend, Peter St Onge. Welcome, Peter.
Hello. Oh my gosh, the microphone works.
You're
Look at
famous.
that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me here.
So Peter has a day job at Heritage Foundation, but I mean, he's really famous for his videos and his excellent, honestly, fantastic explanations of what's going on around the world in macroeconomics and finance, and giving people just a little bit of a taste of economics in these short 3-minute videos. He is also a fellow at the Mises Institute. Funnily enough, Peter and I knew each other kind of before Bitcoin days. We knew each other from libertarian world, but now here we both are in the Bitcoin world. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming. It's an honor that there are so many people interested in Austrian economics. So thrilled to be here.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about Austrian economics for dummies. Now I know many of you here, if you're here, you're not a dummy, you're a smart person. But we're going to try and keep it accessible for people and make it easy for people to understand. So obviously, let's start with the obvious question: what is Austrian economics?
All right, so I think that Austrian economics, the way that it got the name is that in the 19th century, the German-speaking world was really the center of economics. And that meant two countries, which were Prussia and Austria. And the Prussian government had figured out that economics was a very, very useful propaganda tool. And so they funded universities and economists. And they really turned them into what Rothbard called the intellectual bodyguard of the regime. The Austrian government did not do this. If you're a fan of Hans Hermann Hoppe, they had a very, very different relationship with academia. They did not fund them. So that meant that the Austrians were the losers. They had no money. They didn't have the prestigious positions. They didn't have the big salaries. And so the Prussians would look down on them, and they would sort of make fun of them as, the Austrians. So I think that's really the roots of Austrian economics, is that we are non-government economics. That is to say, we continue the 500-year tradition of economics, going back to the scholastics, really going back thousands of years. Murray Rothbard has written an amazing book going through thousands of years of economic history. We continue to carry that torch. We are, in my view, the real economics. We are the evolutionary process of economics. The other guys are paid shills.
Love it. I love it. And it's interesting to note that there's classical economics, and I think if you went and looked at what Mises was doing, it's not that he would have called himself an Austrian economist. He just thought we were just doing economics. And he was explaining what the method of that was. Now, we're going to get into that. That method is known as praxiology. So, Peter, what is praxiology?
So I think of it as a theory of action. So you can observe that people are doing things, and then the question is, why are they doing that? And that's really the essence of economics, right? A lot of economics does not deal with money. So you're asking, why do people get married? Why do they choose careers? Why do they make a ham sandwich instead of sleeping in? And so with praxiology, you can sort of analyze why people are doing things. That's then useful. Unfortunately, it's useful for governments because they want to try to get people to do different things. But it's also very, deeply interesting, I think, for us as sort of social theorists, of course, also to point out exactly why the things the government is trying to get you to do are bad. And it turns out to be extremely useful when you are trying to analyze money. At core, Austrian economics uses a deductive method. So there are 4 axioms, which are sort of propositions that we accept as true because they're so obvious, which are, the action axiom is really the deepest one. That's the idea that human action has a purpose. People are not ants in a farm. We are not, balls rolling around on a pool table. We actually, humans get up and do things because we have some goal. We want to make our life better in some way. We perceive what kind of life we have at the moment. We would like to improve that in some way. So I get up and get a ham sandwich because I'm hungry and because I think it might taste good. Okay, so I then I invest resources. I stand up and walk to the kitchen and use my ham because I'm hoping to have a better life in the future. So that's really the core one. And that might sound really obvious. That's why we call it an axiom, because it is friggin' obvious. But the weird thing is that is not what mainstream economists do. What they do is they go through statistics, they sort of observe people, The famous line from Adam Smith is, people have a propensity to truck and barter, as if we're ants in a farm. Like, people just truck and they sit around and trade things. We can get into later on a specific example of an application of how we come up with different conclusions. And then there's a couple of other ancillary axioms, which are, humans differ, leisure is a good, and people exchange things. So why do I list 4? Because you can derive all of economics from those 4 axioms. If you accept that those 4 things are true, people do things on purpose, people are different than each other, they like leisure, which is unconstrained activity, you don't have any obligations, and that we trade things. If you accept those 4 things, which does not seem that controversial, that's not a Democrat versus Republican thing, that's pretty freaking obvious, I think. If you accept those, all of economics comes out of that. And for me, that was shocking. I did my undergrad in economics, and I did a mainstream program in Canada. And what was shocking to me is that you had all of this beautiful math, this beautiful theory, and it was all garbage. It was completely wrong. And then my first job out of college was in marketing. And what struck me in marketing is that those theories, they were embarrassing. They were goofy. They were things like, if you show your logo 7 times, people will buy it. They were embarrassing, but yet they were true. And so for me, I was like, wait a minute. Okay, so why is it that the guys with the big brains have these beautiful models that are false, and then the guys who don't even try? And so for me, Austrian was really an eye-opener because finally I had found something that actually had logical underpinning. The whole thing is, it's transparently deductive. Like Bitcoin, you can see, it's like open source. You can see everything inside of it. Okay, you don't have any hocus pocus. You don't have any magic. You don't have gatekeepers to keep out the riffraff. And yet, it's actually accurate. It predicts how people behave.
Fantastic. And I'll just share a little bit of my experience with Austrian economics as well. So I'm 35. I first got into Austrian economics. My first exposure was about 14 or 15 years old, right? So I've been down this rabbit hole for about 2 decades now. And I got exposed on an IRC channel. And basically I was on this politics channel. This guy kept linking to Mises' daily articles. And it made so much more. Now, initially I thought, it doesn't really make sense. But over time, it sort of clicked. It made more sense to me than the stuff they were teaching me in high school and university. It just was common sense. Now, at that age, I didn't quite understand why, but I think this praxiological question gets to why is that? Why is it that it makes so much more sense? It's because you're reasoning in a deductive way. So if you're sort of struggling to get this concept of praxiology, it's sort of like, think of it like you start with these basic kind of assumptions or axioms, and you reason in a deductive way, right? I'll make a silly example, right? So let's say I've got my little notepad with the notes, and Peter's got his water bottle. If I were to try and trade this, this notepad for Peter's water bottle, clearly, and we both did that trade, before we entered into that trade, we a priori both thought we were going to profit from that exchange, right? I'm going to give him the notepad, he's going to give me the water. And if that were not true, what would happen? We would not go through the exchange to begin with. It's a very simple example, but it shows us with this mutual assurance of voluntary exchange that we are both expecting to profit, right? Which is kind of crazy, right? You would think, well, hang on, isn't it just like equal value? Well, no, actually, it could be you're expecting to profit. Do you want to expand on that?
That was exactly the example that I wanted to use because it's such a beautiful example of it. And when you hear it, it's really obvious, right? Like, of course, we're only going to trade things because we both think that we're going to be better off. This is common sense. Thing is, mainstream economics does not do that. Literally, what mainstream economics says is that if you buy a sandwich for $4, the sandwich was worth $4 because you traded it. That's literally how they do it. Meaning that if you ban sandwiches, nobody is worse off. Nobody's hurt, right? On the one hand, I can't get my sandwich, but on the other hand, I have the $4, and the $4 is worth the same as a sandwich, according to their models. Why do they? That's stupid, right? Because leisure is a good, right? Why aren't people sleeping on the couch? People don't go to the local park and trade identical $1 bills. It'd be a waste of time, right? The only reason why you would bother getting up and sacrificing your valuable leisure is because you expect to profit from it. And so what falls out of that is, first of all, any kind of government intervention which removes options that people used to have necessarily hurts them. Why? Because every transaction is valuable to all the parties who engage in it. If you use violence to stop somebody from engaging in any transaction whatsoever, you have hurt them, which is, that's very different than how the mainstream looks at it. And honestly, a big reason why they do that is because the math is easier. That's literally why they assume that everything is equal value, because the equations work out, which is pretty stupid because it then renders their conclusions completely inaccurate. But that's kind of par for the course for mainstream economics. It's really sort of a parlor game, like a secret handshake, where you join this fraternity that's math-based, and you do that because it's kind of the Wizard of Oz, right? You want to create this mystique to your field so that you can keep out the riffraff, and especially in economics because the attractions are so huge, right? I mean, you can move trillions of dollars. It's a famous case, Marlboro. There was a smoking lawsuit back 25 years ago, and these cigarette companies had to pay a huge, huge fine, and they were all going to go bankrupt. And then one of the firms got an economist on board, and he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to change it so that you, Marlboro, Camel, you guys don't have to pay the fine. All cigarette companies have to pay the fine. Any economist would know that by doing that, you transfer the incidence of the tax. It's no longer paid by Marlboro. See, now it's paid by all smokers. Okay, that was worth $200 billion. All right, so that's the kind of power that you can manipulate with economics. They know this. Governments absolutely know this, which is why, for 150 years, they've infiltrated the field. They continue to, which is why, for me anyway, Austrian is really the freedom version of economics.
And I think it's also an interesting point that, as an example, other schools of thought, it might, I'm making a bit of an analogy, but let's say it's the equivalent of there's a street, you're on a dark street and you're just sort of, you've dropped your keys somewhere and you're searching for those keys. The mainstream economist is sort of the equivalent of like searching, okay, there's one light pole and it's pointing light there. And you're just kind of searching in that area just because that's where okay, yes, there's some light shining down there, but you're kind of ignoring the rest of that street. And I think in a sense, some of the so-called mainstream are basically doing they're being advanced statisticians, but they are not able to understand economic law as it applies in general, because they have neglected the broader framework that comes to us from, well, everybody here is human, I hope, and we are able to use that human framework to understand why we are acting, as opposed to just sort of looking at humans like we're just these kind of robotic automatons, right?
Right, and the key there is that I think most people assume that mainstream economists are trying to discover the truth, and they're not. They are playing a game that has a set of incentives to it, and it includes getting promoted and getting raises and getting invited on government committees and getting funded by nonprofits. There is a whole series of incentives in academia, and the truth is way, way down at the bottom. We saw this in the 2008 crisis, where the field of economics, mainstream economics, utterly failed the entire earth. And, it was a reasonable time to ask, like, why don't we just fire everybody and, either hire somebody else or have nobody at all, because you guys were completely useless. But the key there, nobody did time for that. Nobody got punished for that in academia. Academic economics circled the wagons and said, well, this was all very mysterious, and we're going to need more funding so that we can study where exactly we went wrong this time. I mean, it's an absolute scam. It has nothing to do with the truth. I think that's also what makes me proud to be outside the system. I'm a former professor, and there are some of us who can speak freely at this point, but it makes me proud to be outside of that incentive system, because at that point, you are actually searching for the truth. I think many of us in economics, we were brought to it originally because we wanted to understand how the world works. But once you get sucked into the Borg, into the matrix, you get overlaid with all those incentives and you lose sight. I guess you sort of talk yourself into wanting what your masters want without even realizing that you did it.
Yeah, so in some sense, people have kind of been pushed down a certain pathway without even realizing it. And the other reality of it is that many of the actual professional economist jobs that exist are really jobs at the central bank, or they are jobs looking at, let's say, certain aggregate statistics. And so there's not really a lot of money in being an Austrian economist, is there?
Yeah, there's almost none. Most of it comes from, let's see, you've got some nonprofits. You have a couple of universities that are open towards Austrian economics. So George Mason, Hillsdale, Grove City, but very, very few. And those are the kinds of universities that they're not chasing government money. I mean, generally, the higher you go in academia, the worse, certainly in economics, probably across the board, the worse they are because they are more captured by the government. They have probably higher IQs, but they are more captured. They are not even free to say, even if they somehow stumble across the truth, they're not even free to say it.
They might get cancelled if they do.
They'll absolutely get canceled with that. Yeah, they'll get re-educated if they're in Canada, apparently, yeah.
So, another, I guess, let's put it this way. Are there aspects of Austrian economics that help us understand Bitcoin? And I believe there are, but I'm curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And the key is that there's a lot of hocus pocus on money. A lot of it is intentional. They try to hide it. Money is inherently a little harder to understand. If you're explaining supply and demand for a ham sandwich, people can usually grasp that. Money takes a couple more steps. And I think that they exploit that. And the key for me anyway in Austrian economics is that money is seen as a good just like any other. Okay, money may as well be a ham sandwich. You get a ham sandwich because it tastes good and it chases away the hungries. You get a car because of transportation, because it looks cool. Okay, every product, every good has certain features to it. Money has certain features, and those are store of value and cheap transactions. Okay, and it's just a good. There's no more mystery than that. And people have demand for. They have a certain amount of that they want. So they want to store a certain amount of money for the future. They want to have a certain amount of walking around money so they can buy that sandwich. And beyond that, once they have enough money, they're done demanding money. Now they want stuff instead. So I think in Austrian economics, it really takes the mystery out of it. I think for a lot of monetary economists, like mainstream academic economists, that's sort of disappointing because that's like the source of their superpower is, they can sort of get up there and I alone can predict the weather. Whereas in Austrian economics, it's just a good. But I think that also helps a lot where if you look at Bitcoin using the Austrian model, it takes away a lot of the mystery. So people have a problem that they want to solve, which is they want to store their value for the future. They don't want it to erode. They don't want it to be stolen. They don't want it to be to have tungsten alloy or nickel stuck in the middle of your gold ingot. Okay, there are various things that people are concerned about in storing their money. Meanwhile, people also want to be able to exchange, and they want to do that relatively cheaply. And Bitcoin, gold traditionally has been the solution for that, but gold has, I think, two fundamental flaws. One of them is that you can't sort of issue gold certificates and tell people, I have the gold, it's hidden, trust me. Okay, you actually have to show people where the gold is, right? And that means you have to hire security and walls, and sharks with laser beams. And at that point, government can find it because you got to publish the address, right? So gold is eminently seizable. This has always been throughout history gold's Achilles heel. I think this is, when you talk to fiat people and you tell them why gold is so amazing, sometimes they'll shoot back. They'll say, well, if gold is so amazing, why does no country on earth use it? And the answer is because it's really easy to seize. Governments, there's economy to scale to violence. Governments have figured that out for a long time. And so they have periodically seized the gold. We are currently in one of those steps. So Bitcoin gets around that. And then, of course, on the other metric, which is cost of exchange, compared to gold, in the, I guess it was the late 1960s, France decided that the U.S. was not as trustworthy as it used to be. And so they wanted their gold back. And they literally sent an aircraft carrier to bring the gold back. You don't actually have to do that with Bitcoin, amazingly. You don't. It's one heck of a lot cheaper. So, if you're buying a coffee, then yes, I guess Bitcoin can look expensive. But compared to the other solutions of the store of value problem, Bitcoin is fantastically cheap.
I'll make a few other points that we can get into as well in terms of how Austrians view Bitcoin or money and how that differs from other schools of thought. So, for example, a lot of people are coming from a chartalist or statist school of thought where the government or the king decides what money is. Whereas Austrians, like Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, wrote in The Origins of Money, he was explaining it's a bottom-up, spontaneous process. And it's actually the Austrians who explain that best rather than some of the other schools of thought, right?
Yeah, that's the famous regression theorem. So, sort of the origins of money. It's not that the state is top-down imposing it. Throughout history, you've had the rye stones. You've had all kinds of things used as money. In the early American colonial experience, there's a really interesting series of monies used. We use beaver pelts and all kinds of things. And fundamentally, people would spontaneously choose money based on how good those things were at storing value and at being exchanged. So rye stones are not very good at exchange. It's difficult to pick them up. They worked in, what was it, the Yap Islands? Yeah. They worked there because people kept mental tallies, okay? So it was kind of like, it was actually sort of the equivalent of electronic money, but it was just floating around in people's heads. And then on the other hand, there are other monies that maybe don't hold up so well, like eggs, for example, are fairly expensive to keep, and they don't keep that long. They have a high rate of erosion, even higher than fiat money. But the moral of the story is that people spontaneously generate money on their own. They don't need governments to do that. I think the one thing that I appreciate from shitcoins as an industry is that they've made it really easy to understand exactly how fiat operates for normal people, right? So if you explain to them, like, the US is like Ethereum, and you have these tokens, and they print unlimited number of tokens, and if you try to use other tokens, then they'll arrest you, which is literally true. It sort of crystallizes for people what a joke the system we currently have is, this Ethereum economy of ours.
And one other area that I think Austrians uniquely can help explain something is Bitcoin's fixed supply and why that's not an issue. Because I think, as far as I'm aware, every other school of economic thought tends to rationalize increases in the supply of money. Whereas Mises has famously written that any amount of money, theoretically, is enough to do the job. And it's actually the Austrians who can explain that. So that's something that when you're out there, either for yourself, when you're thinking about this, or when you're talking to people, and they have this concept, it's a common misconception. They have this idea that, the economy can't grow unless the supply of money grows with it, right? Which is a common, it's wrong. Can you explain why, a little bit around this insight?
Yeah, so that's like the most profitable lie that they tell. So of course they're going to tell it over and over. The poison is good for you. And what happens in practice is if you have a fixed amount of gold, let's say, and the economy gets a lot bigger, like if the economy doubles in size because people are producing more stuff, then you can just buy more stuff per gold. It's deflation. This is a good thing. The deflationary periods, if we just look at American history where we have good data, the deflationary periods of American history have been the absolute golden ages, right? These have been periods where we produced stuff. We were growing the economy faster than we were growing the money. That's obviously a good thing when you explain it that way. But people are so brainwashed that they think that we need some, shitcoiner pumping in new cash, which of course, they're channeling to their buddies. It goes to subsidize government debt. It goes to Wall Street. So of course it's self-serving. But right, if you don't have any change in the money that while the economy is growing, right, which is the long-term future of Bitcoin, then you will have the deflationary economy. The last time we had that, which was in the late 1800s, that was you could argue that was the greatest golden age of human history, the period of about 1870 to about 1910, before Wilson screwed it up. And who was the guy? Aldrich, yeah. But at any rate, so, if we go back to that era, almost everything that we marvel at today as high tech and, amazing, my God, what would our ancestors think? Almost all of that was invented in that 40-year period. Like in many ways, we're coasting on fumes since then. Every single thing Elon Musk produces, which are sci-fi miracles, all of them come from the period from 1870 to 1910. Pneumatic tubes, rockets, electricity, magnets, computers, mobile phones, telephone, the whole shebang. So I think if we can get back to that, one of the things I try to do is to talk about that period. In the US, we call it the Gilded Age, which is socialist journalists put that name on it. It's properly called the Golden Age. In Britain, it's called the Victorian Age, of course. And, if Bitcoin takes us back to the Victorian Age with the kind of arts and architecture, the kind of, you can look at political discourse. A couple of years ago, I went through you can run text through this calculator. It's called the Flesch-Kincaid score, and you can estimate what the grade level is. Right? So sometimes if you're writing something and you're worried, maybe this is hard to read, then you'll run it through, and okay, it'll come out as 16th grade, and you said, no, I got to simplify it. So what's fun is that you can run the inaugural addresses for each U.S. president through the Flesch-Kincaid and see what you come out at. All right, and those things are written by political speechwriters. These are professionals. They're well paid. That's the top of the industry. They are writing at who they think is the median American. They are not showing off to PhDs, okay? So this gives you an estimate of what the professionals, how smart did they think people are. So you go back to 1900, 1910, the average inaugural address in the US was about 12th to 14th grade. All right, so that is mid-college level is what the average American was on a modern Flesch Kincaid. You can then go through election by election. It drops like a stone. By the time you get to Obama, it's 8th grade. Trump is 7th grade. Joe Biden is 4th grade. You can run it through. Test it at home. This is what fiat has brought us. So if we go back to that age where we lose our inflation and instead we return to the deflation era, to the era of deflation, that would be a huge welcome change.
Fantastic. And as Peter was mentioning, in that La Belle Epoque golden age, that wasn't even a perfect gold standard. That was referred to as the classical gold standard. But even in that period, there were some periods of a smaller amount. That was just less inflation than what we have today, right? Even then, it wasn't perfect. And I believe from reading some Austrian economics books, I recall it might have been around 1870s or 1880s. There was a period where sort of the money supply mostly stayed flat.
Yep.
And most people's salary stayed flat in nominal terms. But guess what? Their purchasing power was rising. That is the kind of thing that we could see on a Bitcoin standard. And this is where many Austrians are, in a way, pro-deflationist, right? We are pro-deflation in a certain way. And that's where I think people like Jeff Booth have done a great job at helping popularize this notion, right? So Austrians were talking about this stuff for decades. There was Guido Hulsmann and Joseph Salerno and some of these people. And, great credit to Jeff Booth because he helped popularize this idea in his book, The Price of Tomorrow, which sort of almost brought this deflationist argument to the fore and made it more clear for people.
Yeah, Jeff Booth has really been key on that. Murray Rothbard did a study of that period, 1870 to 1880. It's called the Long Depression. Modern mainstream economists, because they're stupid, take the word depression and assume that was a really rough period. So Rothbard went through the production numbers and estimated that real GDP growth was about 7%, which is Singapore managed that today, and that's pretty much it. That's the kind of world that we gave up, and that was simply giving up trading deflation for inflation. So if on top of that we actually add Bitcoin, which is far more efficient than gold, then I think we get an even better world.
Yeah, it's phenomenal what has been taken from us in a way. Now, another common, confusion, and they're sort of related, is the concept of Austrian economics and the concept of libertarianism. Right now, they're not the same. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, in short, I think if you understand physics, then you will believe in gravity. And if you understand praxiology, if you understand what incentives humans actually have, you will believe in freedom. You will become libertarian. And you don't have to. It'll just automatically happen. Because when you go through that deductive method, if people have subjective preferences, in other words, they look around at the world and they decide how they think their life is going to be made better. People know themselves best. They certainly know themselves better than central planners or than a man with a gun collecting taxes. So if people know themselves best and they exactly know what they want, well, then if you want to make the world a better place, then you set them free. You might try to, give them advice. And we're all free to give advice. We give advice all the time, but you can't use violence. Once you start using violence, you are necessarily impoverishing them. And so I think, people sometimes attack Austrian as kind of an ideological. Austrian method itself is not at all ideological. I think most Austrians tend to be for the little guy. They have no sympathy for big business. We understand why there's a place for large companies and big business, but I personally have no love for rich people in particular. But it just automatically follows from that deductive method that you tend to believe in liberty.
And so I think it's important to understand that concept because let me summarize it this way. I like the way Tom Woods has explained it, that Austrian economics itself is value free. We're not assigning a moral valuation to these things. It's just saying if you accept these four axioms that we spoke about and you accept certain economic laws, you will necessarily impoverish that society by imposing things like minimum wage laws and regulations and all of these kinds of things at the government top-down level. It's not assigning a moral good or bad value to that. Austrian economics itself is not doing that. Libertarianism is sort of is ascribing a moral valuation to that, to say, hey, that's immoral to, let's say, impoverish those people by putting in that regulation or having a central bank that makes us poorer. That's the important distinction to make, isn't it?
Right, and the main assumption in Austrian, really, since I guess Jeremy Bentham across most of the moral West, the main assumption is that you want people to be happy. You want the greatest number of people to be happiest, and so the rest of it just follows automatically from that. And when you sort of go through the process, it turns out that freedom is going to be best for people. Freedom is also nice. I mean, pretty much, there's nobody in the world who actually hates freedom. Everybody loves freedom for themselves. So it is clearly a universal human value. It's just that people get into incentive systems where it pays them personally better to violate freedom. Yeah.
So, does Austrian economics have much to say on macroeconomics?
It should not, because we should just kind of let people do what they're going to do. And then at that point, I would love if I could just kind of sit back and watch and enjoy all the amazing things that people come up with, because in freedom, they're going to be much more productive. So I would love that. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. And so most of what I talk about, for example, is macroeconomics, which I hate, but I have to, because that's the main thing the bastards do, because the profit is so high. Fundamentally, because macroeconomics is so much more valuable for the ruling elite, we just saw it in COVID, right? They managed to sort of sweet talk their way into grabbing 6 trillion odd of the world's wealth in one single go. So since it's so valuable, I think that we end up having to defend that wall quite a bit. But fundamentally, in the Austrian sort of ideal world, if everybody's free to do things, then to a certain degree, yes, we can sort of look up above and we can see what people are doing. People are getting wealthier, then we can imagine that they have bigger houses, or they take more leisure time. But at that point, it's more like sort of enjoying and savoring what all people are doing. Whereas I think in mainstream economics, the emphasis is much more, how can I twist this to serve myself in some way?
And another concept that I think is interesting is when you look at economic history, having a grasp of Austrian economics can help you sort of pierce the veil a little bit and understand a little bit more about what was really going on. Because I think Murray Rothbard leveraged his economics knowledge to benefit, because he was able to write economic history about America and around the world in terms of history of economic thought, rather than just sort of accepting the statist narrative hook, line, and sinker. He was able to sort of look through because of his knowledge of Austrian economics. So perhaps it's useful in that context as well.
It's massively useful. I think it gives you a lot more understanding of what exactly is happening, not just happening like on the government level, but happening even in your personal life. One of the examples, I would always start strategy class talking about the ham sandwich question, right? And you invest time. I mentioned earlier, right? You invest time because you're hoping to get some sort of payoff. There's always risk. It's possible that the ham doesn't taste good. Maybe you'll trip on the way to the bathroom. Every action that you take in life is an entrepreneurial decision. Life is entrepreneurship. There's a certain amount of risk to it. But what I love about economics as a system, and specifically Austrian economics, is that exactly that. You can sort of, it's like that scene in The Matrix where suddenly it's no longer a doorway in a hallway, but now, he sees all the lines in it. And it's like everything now translates into that, and you can sort of analyze it. You can decide what's the best thing for you to do. What are the risks involved? What are the asymmetric payoffs? So for me, it's I love the method.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about some resources and things for people who want to learn a little bit more about Austrian economics. Of course, people follow Peter online, follow me online. You can learn a bit from that. But do you have any resources that you think would be really good books for people to read if they want to? Yeah. If you piqued their interest, what's a good first book to read?
I think the best first book, and I try to orange pill people at Heritage. I always start with this. Murray Rothbard's "What Has the Government Done to Our Money?" Ron Paul more or less rewrote that in his End the Fed. He had a lot more, inside baseball stuff about how Congress works and such. But that, for me, is the book. And if you can get somebody to read that book, then they're on your side. Like, once they actually understand what a scam, how much death and destruction central banks cause, right? That for me is really the first step. And at that point, once you've gotten them to see through fiat money, I mean, gold, Bitcoin, they're 90% there. And then at that point, specifically for Bitcoin, basically to make them understand why it's not a scam. So I think Seyfriedin's book is probably the next step after that. So like first you want them to understand there's a problem. I think that's the Rothbard book. And then the next step is you want them to understand there's a solution. And for me, I would recommend Seyfriedin.
Fantastic. And so I think there's some other interesting theories and things we could get into. We probably don't have time to go into detail on them, but I think one of my personal favorites is The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann. I think that book, if you're a Bitcoiner and you read that book, it will really click it in. The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann. I've got an episode with the author, episode 51 of my podcast, if you're interested. That's a really great book because it teaches you a little bit about the history of money and how it got corrupted. Fiat money did not just come about because we all agreed to it. No, it was forced on the population. And once you understand that, then you can start to understand, the case for Bitcoin. And it's interesting, you mentioned what has government done to our money. I, in fact, included that on Sailor Academy in the Bitcoin for Everybody course. I included a chapter from that very book because I thought it was fantastic. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of theory, and there's of course 1,000-page tomes that you can read, things like Human Action, Man, Economy, and State. But I think you can sort of work your way up to those. And of course, there's books by Safedine. There's books by Per Byland. I think he's a great short one called How to Think About the Economy.
Yes.
Another classic is Henry Hazlitt's book. The Seen and the Unseen, right? The Economics in One Lesson. Yep. So I think those are some great books to sort of get you started. And some any other resources, any closing thoughts?
No, those are all very good. I did want to recommend, though, in general, I'm a huge fan of reading classic books over and over. I think that you haven't really read a book until you've read it 3 times. And so, but yes, I think step 3 is Human Action. Human Action is kind of like the graduate course. Like once you've fully read that, and I do recommend audiobook because it's not that easy to read, at least for me. But so I've listened to it 3 times. But anyway, yeah, once you go through those 3 books, I think you know a lot more economics than any mainstream PhD, I think, without a doubt. I've got a video coming out tomorrow on the origins of fiat money in Song Dynasty China.
Fantastic.
So, yep.
All right, well, I think we'll finish up there. Everyone, make sure you follow Peter online. Check out his videos. Everyone, put your hands together. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Do you have your ticket to the next Pacific Bitcoin Festival? Join us as we shine a light on the best of Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. Visit pacificbitcoin.com for the best deal on tickets now.